this is Andrei Roman. I'm the CEO of AtlasIntel, and I'm welcoming you to a new edition of Atlas Deep Dive. We will be discussing the first time our polling on the Trump second term. And joining me, we have in our Rio de Janeiro office, Yuri Sanches, our head of political analysis.
Hi, it's a pleasure.
And in Sao Paulo, a guy you already know, Pedro Azevedo, our head of US coverage.
Happy to be here.
And now let's move to what we're actually here for, which is discussing our latest poll on the Trump administration. This was a poll conducted between the 7th and the 12th of March, 2,550 respondents. It's an adult population concept, so this is no longer a likely voter concept as we usually had it during the election cycle last year. It is a sample that's representative on the standard demographic variables by gender, age, education level, region, race, and household income. We don't calibrate on partisanship, but you have the details on the partisan makeup of the sample on this slide. The initial result is that for the first time since Trump assumed as president, in his second term, we have a majority disapproving the president, 52.4% to be more precise, 47.3% approval rate, and 0.3% declared that they don't know whether they approve or disapprove Trump. In the time series, we see a drop of 3 percentage points relative to February, an increase of almost 3 percentage points in the disapproval rating. And when we look at the evaluation of the Trump performance, incorporating categories, poor, very poor, excellent, good, or regular, what really stands out here is the fact that we have a very tiny portion of the US public right now considering that the Trump administration is regular. This actually was already very small in previous polls. It stood at 6% in February, and now it dropped to only 2.6%. So essentially, a very polarized public, 51.9% poor or very poor rating, 45.5% excellent or good. When we analyze the issues, ongoing immigration is the topic on which the Trump administration gets its best marks, 52% good or excellent, and the net positive of 5 percentage points. In general, everything is very polarized, and what's very interesting here is that if on some of the topics that Trump wasn't scoring that well before, he's actually improved his performance, and on some of those where he was doing excellent before, it's not really that case anymore. So the evaluations essentially are converging between topics, and that's also kind of a mark of a very polarized public. When it comes to national debt, for example, the evaluation increased, probably because of the spotlight on Dodge and Elon Musk. When it comes to immigration, the disapproval rating went down. However, when it comes to the US economy, and that's perhaps the single most important issue here, as we'll continue to see in this poll, the excellent good rating went down from 50% to 48 percentage points. And when it comes to the excellent rating, that decreased way more. So this kind of correlates with why, even though these graphs don't look that bad, the overall rating stands out in terms of the disapproval rate going up. I will ask you, Yuri, what do you think, given the fact that when we look at sector by sector evaluation, things don't necessarily look that bad. Why do you think that, based on the data we have here, disapproval rating went up relative to February?
I think that maybe this new Trump administration, his new term, Trump is being somehow, in some ways, in some areas, a bit more aggressive than what was previously expected, not during his campaign, but in comparison with his first term, for example. So I think that he is going further than he has before on many issues. When we look at, for example, he has a net positive approval rating on his handling of immigration, and we see here a very considerable drop on Americans' worries about immigration. It drops from 51% in January to 35% now, as one of the key challenges of the US currently. And we see that most of Trump's day one executive orders on immigration, I think that they might have created a sense that this issue was being handled accordingly. You might have differences on his approach to immigration, but it could have made things better than they were before. But on the other hand, when we look at other of his initiatives, for example, with Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency, his trade war with Europe and Canada and Mexico, and how it could affect U.S. economy, we see that the fact that he's going further than he has before might have raised concerns about how this could impact U.S. economy, U.S. The lives of American people, and it creates an amount of uncertainty of how it all could play out in the end.
Pedro?
Well, yes, exactly. Like Yuri was saying, I think there's a lot of uncertainty right now, and especially around what we're seeing with the economy, right? And we're seeing, like we were seeing in our time series here, that concerns about the economy, about inflation, about the national debt, they're all still at the same level, the same high level they were since last year's. This was already one of the big topics, maybe the main topic in the 2024 election. And while, an important topic for Trump, that's immigration, has been having its salience reduced, perhaps exactly because he has been taking so much action there that people maybe feel like that's no longer a big problem. But we see that the concerns with the economy keep growing, right, or keep at the same level. So this uncertainty and this uncertainty around tariffs and around this more active approach that he has been taking on around a lot of issues that maybe causes some concern about the future there for the population.
When it comes to the economy, it's not really the case that Americans believe it's a disaster, right? I mean, going back to this graph, you have pretty much a tie between those that evaluate the current administration as positive and as negative. I think the issue here, though, is that there isn't that feeling of certainty that things will turn out well. It was kind of a given during the election campaign that one of the major challenges for the Democrats in terms of arguing for continuity was their handling of the economy, particularly when it comes to inflation. And people were expecting that, given Trump's record with rapidly increasing asset prices at the beginning of his first term, with pro-business or business-friendly policies, with his, know-how as a successful businessman, that he would do extremely well in terms of recreating a platform of prosperity for the U.S. economy. And many people continue to support the president as he, tries to create the foundations of what he sees as, the solid recovery of strategic economic sectors, particularly in the industrial and manufacturing segments of the economy. There are expectations that maybe Trump's policies will eventually succeed. If only some of the major U.S. champions at the global level would bring back some of their operations in the U.S., open factories. Maybe this is something that is feasible, only that increasingly people are starting to see the costs of the new Trump approach, and they're not quite sure whether it will be worth it in the end, right? So you have some of the retaliatory measures taken by Canada, higher energy prices from Ontario. You have the European Union announcing its own package of retaliation measures. Mexico hasn't really done anything because Mexico perhaps is more terrified than any other country as to what a trade war with the U.S. would mean for the Mexican economy. But besides that, world leaders have been pretty clear that they don't want a trade war, but should it occur, they will respond, and then there will be some pain to share with the U.S. and implicitly with the American public. And I think increasingly Americans are starting to fear that, even as they're hopeful, almost half of them, that Trump, really handles well the art of the deal, and that in the end things will work out just fine. I think we're kind of in a period of a break in terms of the initial expectations that people had when it comes to the economy. People just thought Trump will come, everything will be amazing right away. All the policies that will be adopted will be creating prosperity in the short term. And now what they're seeing is that it's not really clear that it's going to happen in the short term. And guess what? If there's a recession, maybe it's not even going to happen in the medium term. And will it really be worth it in the long term? I think that's part of the discussion here.
So that's with Trump himself and the administration itself now beginning to recognize the possibility of a recession, right? Because it feels like in the last perhaps the last 2 weeks, there's been sort of a shift in the rhetoric by the administration from, there's probably going to be some problems from all the problems that Biden left behind, but we're going to be fine, to maybe this week we've been seeing Trump and some other members of the administration sort of refusing to rule out a recession and saying, it might happen, but it's a period of transition and we're going to have to adjust, but perhaps starting to recognize that this might be possible, right? So I feel like that risk is very sort of front and center for the people right now.
It's also interesting that we have kind of this disconnect between how well the government is rated on specific topics and the fact that Trump has never seen his positive rating in terms of his personal image be any better. It's also the case that the main leaders of the Democrats are at a historical low. So if you look at the temporal time series for Obama's favorability, Biden's, pretty much all the major leaders that Democrats have had over the past 2 decades, they're in a huge crisis of popularity. But at the same time, many of the elements of the Trump agenda are not exactly popular, right? So take tariffs, for example. When we ask about tariffs against specific countries being adopted as a negotiation tactic, that's supported by 39% strongly in favor, plus 6% mostly in favor, but that's rejected by a majority of Americans. And when we ask about raising tariffs across the board to protect US manufacturing, the level of support decreases further to only 34% strongly in favor and 7% mostly in favor. And then there's also some of the we have some of the proposals that have been kind of thrown out there by Trump that we're not really sure if they're serious or not, if he really means it, if he's using whatever he's saying as a bargaining tool to get something else. But inevitably, people talk about them, and it turns out taking control over Greenland doesn't have us a majority support in the U.S. public. Talking about an annexation of Canada doesn't have great support. So at the margin, the more you see the administration insist on some of these topics that are kind of borderline important to what really matters to the U.S. right now, which is making sure that the economy doesn't get into a recession, dealing with the major strategic challenges that the country has, migration, the competition with China, figuring out, the new role of the U.S. in a context where geopolitical context worldwide is getting much more complicated. Kind of focusing on some of these issues, my understanding is that inevitably it will gradually erode the base of support that the administration has. Now, having said that, when we look at Trump's own personal rating, he's doing really well. The level of support in March is stable. It actually, oscillated positively from 50 to 51%. And just in line with the negative rating, so nothing really concerning here. Same thing for JD Vance, and at the same time, you see that in the overall ranking of political leaders, a new situation that we've detected in our two first polls this year, which is a deterioration of the Democratic leaders, that kind of continues to hold. On the other hand, when it comes to the cabinet members, we're seeing a pickup in disapproval ratings, in particular for Elon Musk at 54% negative rating. That was not the case in the previous polling. For Robert F. Kennedy, but I would say most concerning for Marco Rubio, who was previously the most popular leader of the cabinet and now appears second after Peter Hegseth, probably because of a decimal or something like that. But he definitely doesn't stand out as much as he did before. Any idea, Pedro, as to why this could have taken place with Rubio?
Well, I'd point out, Andrei, that like you've shown us here, that we see that Trump's personal approval rating, positive image, remains at a very high level, and the fact that the rest of the administration has taken on a more negative image. Maybe that also reflects what we see in the beginning about the approval of Trump's presidency and the evaluation of how the administration is going. Maybe Trump's personality and his own, personal image has weathered this impact of this uncertainty of what we're seeing, but we see that others haven't, right? And we see that Marco Rubio, he seems to have had. Perhaps he seems to have taken a backseat, right? Because we see Trump himself taking credit for negotiations and for sitting down and for even when it's a negative image, right? When, like, we saw Trump and JD Vance sitting with Zelensky in the Oval Office and the argument that they had. I mean, we are seeing all these evolutions here, but I feel like Marco Rubio is getting only the short end of the stick right here, right? Because we see every advance, we see Trump at the front, right? Whether it's negotiations with Ukraine or tariffs. And at the same time, if Americans' opinions of Trump's foreign policy are getting worse, then that would also, of course, have a poor reflection on the Secretary of State, right? Where if you think that Trump is maybe being excessive in tariffs or in his approach to Ukraine, you're probably wondering, why isn't the Secretary of State doing anything, right? What is Marco Rubio's job here if in this chaotic moment, he hasn't had a very high profile, I'd say.
There's also a recent episode that many have commented on that is a conflict, an open conflict, an open discussion in Trump's Oval Office between Elon Musk and some of the key members of the cabinet, with essentially many people trying to contain Musk's agenda and influence, particularly when it comes to cutting the workforce. And it appears that during this meeting, Rubio and Musk specifically clashed. And this is something that has generated quite a lot of public discussion. People saying that Musk was complaining to Rubio about the fact that he hadn't fired enough staff from the State Department, and Rubio essentially saying that he had done it. That if Musk wanted, he could hire these people before, just that they could get fired once again. Well, guess what? It's the kind of discussion where the people who really like Rubio will start disliking Musk, and the people who really like Musk will start disliking Rubio, and at the end of the story, who will come out kind of winning from this? Well, someone who's not involved, which is in this case Peter Hegseth, and who appears at the top of our ranking now. Hegseth has also, pursued some very high-profile initiatives within his own department, but he hasn't gotten into any conflict with any of the other administration members so far. So to my mind, I think that conflict between Rubio and Musk is pretty much what explains their drop, and it's both of them in terms of favorability between our polls in our poll in February and what we're seeing today. Now that we've started talking about Rubio, one of the major topics for the Trump administration today is the Ukraine. He's gotten a lot of criticism in the US for the way he handled the meeting with President Zelensky. Zelensky obviously also didn't get much love from the US conservative media for the way he handled himself during that meeting. So it's interesting to see here where Americans stand when it comes to the war in Ukraine. What can you tell us about that, Yuri?
I think that this chart presents us with some kind of pattern. We see that Americans in general, a large majority of 63%, support the decision to start negotiations with Russia. So the US having a decisive leading role in trying to end the Ukraine war. So the US paving basically the way to ending the situation, the war there. Although the majority of the Americans tend to disagree with the way that the Trump administration is handling currently those issues. When we see that 74% of Americans understand that the main culprit of the Ukraine war is actually Russia, and in fact, half of Trump's voters in the last election, we see that even Trump supporters, even Trump voters, they tend to understand that Russia is the main aggressor. Russia is to blame for the situation in Ukraine. So excluding, for example, the Ukrainian government from negotiations with Russia is highly opposed by the majority of the Americans. 66% of Americans oppose this kind of initiative. Also excluding partners from the European Union and from NATO also does not sound good with the American audience. And also when we see that excluding a pathway for Ukraine to join NATO, especially, we see also a majority here. So there is, or there might be, an understanding that something that Denmark's Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen said, that maybe the cheapest way out of the Ukraine war and to prevent other wars by Russia, other invasions of Ukraine or nearby countries, might be for Ukraine to join NATO. So that might end Russia's intention of aggression or imperialism somehow. So
it really depends, though, whether you think that that would really deter Russia, because if Russia continues its war in Ukraine, even as Ukraine joins NATO, or let's say you have some peace agreement or ceasefire, let's say, I don't think Ukraine will join NATO in the short term.
No.
I don't think that option is on the table. It's certainly not on the table for the Trump administration. And I would say that there are several European allies that would block that as well.
Yeah.
Germany has made a point of always clarifying that they don't really like the idea of Ukraine joining NATO. I mean, they could have done this before. This is a discussion where Bush, while he was president, wanted to bring Ukraine into NATO, and he was blocked by Germany and France.
Yeah.
It was the Europeans who said no to Ukraine joining NATO.
Even the recent entry of Sweden and Finland was not something that everyone was willing to do right away. So, for example, Turkey.
Right. So this is much more complicated in practice
Yeah.
To achieve. And it would set a really poor precedent for an alliance that's already kind of shaky. For it to be attacked, not knowing that you would actually have mutual defense when that takes place.
Yeah.
But it is nonetheless interesting. One thing is to say, well, Ukraine shouldn't join NATO right now. It's something completely different from saying Ukraine will never join NATO.
Exactly.
And this is kind of like a definitive promise that we make to Russia, because it kind of seems like you're putting Ukraine on a silver plate and giving it to Putin at the time when many have sympathy for a nation that has suffered an invasion and territorial loss and the horrible human tragedy that is unfolding
Sure.
in the regions where Russia has started the war in Ukraine. So as a result of this, I think it's interesting that even as Zelensky's visit was very much commented in U.S. media, and that he was very criticized by conservatives, and even as there's kind of this tendency of more sympathy for Russia's version of the story in some conservative circles, when it comes to public opinion, this hasn't really shifted. So still, Ukraine has a much better favorability, both as a country and in terms of its president, than Russia. So this makes it kind of a topic that doesn't really add to Trump's popularity right now. It's also the case that it doesn't really subtract. I mean, if we have to find a story right now as to why Trump's rating decreased from February to now, it's not really about Ukraine. It's pretty much, the drop is small, and it's essentially focused entirely on the economic story and not on this. Still, there is this, at the same time that the US administration wants to end the war in Ukraine, you've seen a much more activist posture in terms of dealing with the politics of other countries, in particular, kind of making a point of supporting, right-wing candidates in elections. It happened with Elon Musk in Germany with the AfD. We're seeing Elon now talk more and more about South Africa as well. I think there's some concern in some Latin American countries as to potential U.S. involvement. In Brazil, there's a bit with Bolsonaro. There was the visit of Marco Rubio to El Salvador and sort of this alliance with Bukele. So it appears that even as the Trump administration wants to extract itself from Ukraine so that it can focus on geopolitical issues globally, one of the approaches it has to these geopolitical issues is kind of reinforcing an arch of conservative allies in key democracies. So they're trying to boost the electoral chances of these forces. That's kind of a way they're looking at dealing with Europe. If we don't have a friendly government in Germany right now, well, maybe we should get one. There's an election, let's help out the people that we like. Mm-hmm. It appears that the US public doesn't really like that approach. 78.8% say that the Trump administration shouldn't support specific parties or candidates in upcoming elections in Europe and Latin America. And yet, you kind of see this pattern repeat itself. So why do you think that's the case, Pedro? Why do you think that, for example, Elon, kind of continues to talk about all of these? He talked about Romania one of these days.
Yeah.
There will be a presidential election there, and one of the candidates got disqualified by the Supreme Court, and Elon went very strongly to denounce that is taking place. And since Elon is, very prominent in the current U.S. administration, that has a political impact in terms of the discussions taking place in Romania, just as it happened in Germany, just as it's happening in South Africa. So, is this do you see this as a risk for the Trump administration in terms of its standing with the U.S. public, or not? And what should we expect going forward?
Well, we should probably expect this to keep happening, to be real with you, Andrei, especially because I don't think this is very damaging to the Trump administration's reputation, even with this large majority of Americans saying that they shouldn't get involved. Foreign policy is typically a very low salience topic for Americans, and like we were saying in the last section about Ukraine. Perhaps people are unhappy with the way the negotiations are being conducted, and people are still sympathetic for Zelensky, but that doesn't seem to have a very large impact on the Trump administration's image. And at the same time, while it has a very little impact in terms of public opinion, it is very advantageous for the Trump administration and for Elon Musk specifically, but to have these ties with parties and politicians of similar ideologies in other countries, right? So it's beneficial when Trump is seen by a lot of the global, conservative movement as an idol and as someone that will that these politicians want to cater to. It makes every sense for someone like Elon Musk to go and try to promote these people, to make the section that will be most favorable to Trump more powerful in their own countries, right? And I think it is especially the case that Elon Musk has some plausible deniability because he's in that sort of ambiguous position where no one exactly knows where he fits in the U.S. government's hierarchy, right? What is the Department of Government Efficiency? The White House says that he's actually just a senior advisor to Trump, that he doesn't have an official bureaucratic position. He can say that he's acting in his personal capacity or as a private person, as the owner of Twitter. And so I think that provides an extra layer of sort of insulation on top of the American public not really caring a lot. The fact that it's especially Elon Musk doing it, there's some sort of plausible deniability.
I think that's totally true. And it's certainly the case that traditionally the US public didn't care so much about external affairs, particularly when there wasn't a war taking place. And the war is usually, the US is policing all these places around the world, but the war is usually kind of distant. There's all this talk about, respecting our soldiers and veterans, but at the end of the day, the US presidents have gotten themselves involved in so many wars, with such frequency, that because of technological advance and being able to deploy fewer and fewer soldiers, at some point they were controlling Afghanistan with only 5,000 soldiers. This kind of gets very remote from the reality of most Americans. So particularly when it's not with the filter of war, foreign policy is not something that's salient for the American public. And then even in the case of war, because of the trend of committing fewer and fewer troops, even as these military operations continue, kind of the trend is going into the same directions. Fewer people will be paying that much attention to what's taking place. Now, that may change though when you have a conflict with Canada or with the European Union. I mean, people travel to Italy and Spain and France. Americans love to travel. When it comes to Canada, there's sort of this cultural connection that really exists. And this is something very new. It wasn't the case before that the US was in a conflict with such important allies and such important cultural references for the US. I mean, these are, important countries within the Western world. It's not the same, fighting with Venezuela or with some country in Asia when you fight with Germany or France or Canada. And what we see in our polling is that, Americans, by considerable majorities, think that the relations with the European Union should be better than they currently are. 53% think that the current US administration is more distant to the European Union than it should be. Only 7% think that it's closer, and 31% think that it's okay. So that's, a considerable problem for the conduct of the current foreign policy of the US, should it continue. With Canada, it's kind of the same. 56% think that the US is more distant under the current administration from Canada than it should be. 49% when it comes to Ukraine, 50% when it comes to Mexico, 44% when it comes to the United Kingdom. And now on the other hand, when it comes to Russia, there's a majority of 60%, essentially, that, actually it's 53%. 53% of Americans who say that America is closer to Russia than it currently should under this administration, and only 7% say that it should get closer to Russia. So between 53 and 7, I see a considerable margin for, the Democrats kind of continuing to hark on Russia as something that is salient, even in the entire history that we know, with Hunter Biden and the laptop and things that weren't definitively proved or that can be proved for what that's worth.
Yeah, I think that Trump kind of understood that in order for him to make his vision of the U.S. internally become true, he might need some support from other parts of the world, particularly from allies. So it kind of makes him think that. Particularly Elon Musk, for example, in relation to Germany or to Romania, or even J.D. Vance in the Munich Security Conference talking about kind of lecturing the United Kingdom on freedom of speech. I think that the kind of approach that they might have found was trying to shift the main sources of concern from Russia or China, for example, to, in fact, freedom of speech in the free world, in the Western world, as a source of maybe boosting candidacies from possible allies, from, for example, the AfD or Călin Georgescu in Romania. But on the other hand, we see clearly that the American public is still not very happy with the level of proximity or maybe friendship that's been going on between Donald Trump and Russia, or maybe trying to make Russia's actions in Ukraine or against Ukraine seem maybe equivalent of what Ukraine or Zelensky has been doing. I think that does not sound well to the American public. On the other hand, we see that stability among allies is important as well for a US leading role in the world. So at the same time that Trump wants to make America win every day in terms of foreign relations as well, positioning himself as one of the main presidents in the world, the main characters in the world. It is hard to do that when you have your allies maybe not thinking that you are actually an ally anymore, and what he has accomplished so far, especially in the European Union or in NATO. I think he has partially achieved some of his results. For example, making Europe pay more for its own defense. So it is a win. He can communicate that to the American public. But on the other hand, we see that defense companies in Europe have been benefiting more from this the flow of investment going from the United States to Europe and creating a more integrated European Union or NATO aside from the US partnering with them. So it might be it's a two-way road. It's not exactly.
So it's very important for the U.S. strategic interest long term for Europe to figure out its defense.
Yeah.
How to pay for it, and more importantly, how to operationalize it. Right.
Yes.
In terms of weapons, in terms of actual combat-ready forces. Should Trump be successful in doing that, I mean, he would be strengthening Europe and strengthening the ecosystem of alliances that the US has. But it's not really clear, though, to me, that the strategy he's currently on will actually get Europe to be stronger as opposed to weaker. And I don't think that a weaker Europe is in the interest of the US long term. There's also kind of a parenthesis to this, which is another possible trajectory where Europe actually does get stronger, but because it got stronger, kind of distances itself from the US and kind of pursues a separate future, which in the long term may also not be in the interest of the US. So this kind of like tough love that Trump is professing, like many of his bets, it can go really well or it can go really, really bad at the end. And I think the Europeans are trying to figure that out as well. I mean, okay, so let's say that now as Europeans we're faced with drafting a new security policy for ourselves. It may be the case that the fractious nature of European politics itself puts so much strain on whatever effort of integration that Europeans have already achieved. The EU, European Commission, that even some of the things that they are able to collaborate on so far will get much harder, let alone integrating to work together on a common foreign policy or common defense. That would be the direction of weakening of Europe as we know it, and with that, really the role that Europe has in the U.S. system of alliances. Now, going back to our original graph, do you think, Pedro, that this is the beginning of a tendency of erosion? Is this sort of a temporary blip? So we'll see, the ratings improve soon in the short term. What do you make of this initial drop in disapproval rates? Where do you see it going next?
Well, I would say, Andrei, that here at the beginning, our polls in January and February, we had him at 50% approval, 50-50 basically, and I think that's basically the ceiling for him. It's already, even with this slightly negative rating, it's already one of the best ratings he has. If we compare that with his approval during his first term, this is still a very strong result for him. So I would say that it's very hard for this to improve much for him, for Trump. I wouldn't necessarily say that this right now is the beginning of a trend and that his approval is going to crash or anything. But it will definitely depend on the impact of the tariffs and of his, his economic policy more broadly, right? Because as we said at the beginning, and as we have been seeing in our polls, the economy and inflation keep appearing at the top of the list of key issues for Americans. And we see this slight growth in disapproval here as related to his economic policy. And so I would say that if we're starting to see the costs now of his approach, like we were saying in the beginning, and it's likely that we're going to see this disapproval grow at least a little bit more. At the same time, if he continues performing well on immigration and on, mostly all of the other topics, we saw that he was still doing, he had some pretty good approval ratings, right? That should hold him up for a while, even if the economy doesn't go well. But in the medium term, if we see this impact of the tariffs, especially, rising prices and disrupting the business of American companies, I think that's going to be very difficult for him to recover from, because I feel like it was the main problem for Biden, and it will still be the main problem for Trump. People were optimistic, and now he didn't immediately fix everything, because of course he can't immediately fix everything. And so now people are beginning to doubt again, and that is still going forward going to be his main issue here, is the economy and how the tariffs and his spending cuts and how his changes he does to the federal government, how is that going to affect the economy, essentially, right?
Yeah, I agree. I think that the most worrying part of this all is that most of the measures he was planning haven't yet been enacted, and also we haven't yet started to see the impact of these measures. And even as that is still kind of we're at the distance of from that happening, the impact in the financial markets has been really negative. We have a free fall in Bitcoin, we have a free fall in the stocks. There's really a confidence crisis right now in the financial markets as to what the Trump economic policies mean for the U.S. economy. You see talk about the possibility of a recession. I mean, the kind of stuff that is really worrying, particularly when the impact of these measures hasn't yet been felt, because some of the measures haven't even been implemented yet. So I think that will likely limit some of the measures that were being discussed. And I think that may lead to some changes in the communication that Trump has going forward. So I would expect, the talk about tariffs all the time to diminish. Unless he actually decides that it makes economic sense to enact some of these tariffs. Tax on steel and aluminum. We are sure that we want to do that. We'll do it. It's done. Let's move forward. As opposed to having this discussion all the time as to an impending trade war with some of the most important trade partners that the U.S. has. That perhaps will be something that Trump will be doing less going forward. I don't think it's really because he's going to feel public pressure so much because of our polling or anyone else's polling, or because there will be massive protests against the administration. I mean, this is still an administration that retains, by historical standard, really good approval ratings at this point. He has a popular mandate to govern. But I think it will be more because of the pressure of major companies and business partners, and some of these business partners are in government and they're feeling the pain, like Elon Musk. So they will be looking at how much money they're losing every day, and they will want to make that stop. And if you're in government, you can make that stop very easily. If there was something that you caused that created a negative impact, you just, do the opposite and hope that that you can reverse that impact. Not to say that Trump will just abandon his entire policy platform on the economy, at breakneck speed, but particularly when it comes to communications, if there's things that affect the markets that he'll not even implement, perhaps it doesn't really make sense to talk about those so much. Well, I think with that, we will conclude this edition of Deep Dive. Thank you so much, Yuri. Thank you, Pedro. And see you guys at our next meeting.